All right. So today is going to be more of Buber, I and Thou. Um, so we left off with on reading of I and Thou. We left off with how do we have an I and Thou relation with nature. Um, so recapping the relation with nature is that as human beings we address nature. There is no being addressed back. Now, of course, the problem that arose with this was how do we how do we maintain this mutuality with nature, right? And I think basically my interpretation of this is that actually by addressing nature as thou, you allow it to present itself as it is, and in that case its own presenting itself as it is the mutual relation itself going on. But now we're going to go into Buber addressing the human being, and then we'll go later into the realm of spirit. So let's begin, right? He says, if I face a human being as my thou and say the primary word I thou to him, he is not a thing among things and does not consist of things. Thus, human being is not he or she, bounded from every other he and she, a specific point in space and time within the net of the world. Nor is he a nature able to be experienced and described, a loose bundle of named qualities, but and whole in himself, he is thou and fills the heavens. This does not mean that nothing exists except himself, but all else lives in his light. Um, so here we already get like this difference between meeting a human being as thou, right? It's funny because thou is so mysterious most of the time when you're reading I and thou from Buber, and the only way Buber kind of describes it is there's this negativity going on, right? Well, it's not he or she. It's not in a specific point in space or time. It can't be experienced or just. Um, there's just this wholeness. Nothing exists except himself. That's fascinating. What does that even mean? Nothing exists except himself. And Buber's already trying to make us refrain from already going into like, oh, so you're telling me like there's this subjective eclipse going on where the only subjectivity that matters is my own. um, and I don't think that's what Buber's trying to say, and that's why he says it's not that nothing exists by himself, it's that everything lives in his light. So I know I said earlier, actually I accidentally it's everything but everything except himself. um, but this whole like living everything else lives in his light. um, it's such a ambiguous metaphor, really. um, that everything lives in his light. Of course, theologically, we can understand this, but if we're talking about meeting a human being, which is what this section is about, and encountering them as thou, but then somehow everything lives in his light. There's a very specific italicized his in the I and thou interpretation, which I've always wondered if it is. The way I interpret this actually is that it's thou coming through that particular, right? It's the glimpse of the thou coming out, arising out of, we could say, of the particular. And it's only when we catch the glimpse of the thou that we actually see the person as they are. And I think that's what Buber is trying to get at, right? That there is this glimpse of the thou that makes us see this particular person's light. But anyways, let's go further on. He says, just as the melody is not made up of notes, nor the verse of words, nor the statue of lines, but they must be tugged and dragged till their unity has been scattered into these many pieces. So with the man to whom I say thou. So Buber's saying even when you do encounter, you face a human being as your thou, it will inevitably dissipate. It will disperse. And it seems like it has to disperse. And I think, those are some questions that we will try to leave Buber to answer. Why does it have to disperse? Why can't we sustain the thou? Why can't we? Why is there this inevitable failure that we must meet in order to? And so he says, and so Buber continues, he says, I can take out from him the color of his hair or his speech or of his goodness. I must continually do this, but each time I do it, he ceases to be thou. And just as prayer is not in time, but time in prayer, sacrifice not in space, but space in sacrifice. And to reverse the relation is to abolish the reality. So with the man to whom I say thou. This reversing, I think I read in the beginning about the word reversing. I think the translator talked about it. He debated whether he wanted to use reversing or turn, which would have a totally different, would lead to a different understanding, because it would be like reversing would be like almost sound like an undoing, whereas turning would sound more like there's this shifting, right? It's a shifting rather than a sort of undoing. It's a matter of shifting. So this shifting of the relation is what abolishes reality. Why is that abolishing? And what's also interesting is, like, typically, right, Buber's also kind of testing us in the way that we think, right? We typically think of prayer in time, but not time in prayer. And the same thing, we think about sacrifice in space, but not space in sacrifice. So there is something that occurs here with reality, right? What Buber calls reality seems like there's this inverse relationship going on, right? We're just like, no, it's not. It's like the actuality of it is Well, we could say this: the actuality is the fact that prayer is always in time, but reality for Buber is that actually time is in prayer. It's the other way around. It's like this inverse, but he calls it abolishes, but it's the inverse, but it's that turning to the I-it that abolishes reality. And so let's continue with what Buber's saying. He's saying, I do not meet with him at some time and place or other. I can set him in a particular time and place. I must continually do it. But I set only a he or a she that is in it, no longer my thou. Um, you know, I think if anything, if we get anything out of Buber, Buber really challenges the notion of what does it mean to meet? What does it mean to really meet someone? Right? And the moment you start describing, you're not meeting. The moment you start trying to absorb qualities, you're not meeting. Right? But if we go back to the last video about nature, maybe Buber, what Buber's trying to say is, this pointing out is what does more harm. Well, I won't say, he's not going to say that it does more harm, but this pointing out is what prevents us from meeting, right? And the more conscious you are of this pointing out when you are talking or engaging with people, you'll start to understand that, like, automatically you start pointing out, oh, wow, look at that guy's hair. Or like, oh, I noticed that he's hostile, or I noticed that this person is, aggravating to me, and so on and so on. Like, when you're in the midst of this pointing out, I think Buber would say exactly that. Like, you're not actually meeting. You are simply having this sort of subject-object relation going on. It's you're abolishing reality by doing this. So let's continue. So he says, so long as the heaven of thou is spread out over me, the winds of causality cower at my heels, and the whirlpool of fate stays its course. I do not experience the man to whom I say thou, but I take my stand in relation to him, in the sanctity of the primary word. Only when I step out of it do I experience him once more. In the act of experience, thou is far away. So again, this has probably been one of the most difficult concepts, at least for me, in Buber's writing, is understanding what does he exactly mean by you do not experience a person when you meet them. What does that even mean? The only hint that you kind of get in this page is clearly there's a difference between experience and relation. And clearly there's a difference between also experiencing and being in the primary word. So the way again, this sentence is always troubling to me, because it's like he says, I don't experience the man to whom I say thou. And it's like, okay, I want to say Buber, like a priori experience type of, a priori before experience kind of move here, where it's like you are not using language to meet someone, but instead you are in language to meet someone. And I think there is a way, in a sense, that Buber is getting at, of that actually a lot of us simply use language. And this using language translates into the way we experience in general. Right? Like we could say experience gives us content. Our senses are grabbing at something always, right? But it's the way in which we use that content to not actually meet anyone. So I almost want to say the way I interpret this is there is no experiencing because you are in the language itself. Rather, I mean, this would be like a sort of Heideggerian twist here, where we are dwelling in language rather than being the masters of language. And I think maybe that's even a more helpful understanding, because you can see here where Buber is saying that, but I take my stand in relation to him in the sanctity of the primary word. So it's you're only able to stand in relation because of the primary word, I thou, right? But it's because that is the word is the initiator of language. The word, that primary word, is the initiator of meeting. So there's a way in which actually we could say that what it means to not experience someone is to be in their language, or in the language. It doesn't mean like actually trying to like learn their language in terms of like, I'm going to learn how to speak Japanese or whatever. I'm pretty sure that would help, but it wouldn't guarantee anything. It would mean like to be in the language would mean to be allowing to let something show itself as it is, rather than trying to be the master of the language, which causes separation, which Buber will say later on that actually the I and it relation is a natural relation of separation, whereas the I and thou relation is a natural combination. So yeah, I think I've gone a long time on trying to sort out what Buber means by when you have this thou relationship with a man or a human being, is that you don't and that's very, that's it's a very hard concept to grab around sometimes when you think about it, because you're like, wait a second, why can't I? What does that mean? Don't I technically experience God? Don't I technically experience anything else? Aren't I always already experiencing something? Even nothing, for example. There's those troublesome questions of that. But Buber seems to make this very clear distinction of it's experiencing in the sense of using. It's experiencing in the sense of extracting. But the problem is actually when you really pay attention to your experience, there's never not a moment where you're extracting. But we could say this, maybe Buber is getting at something that is, it's a kind of experience in which you are not extracting. But the funny thing is, the only experience that we know is extraction type of experiences. I feel something, I think something. So it is possible that Buber is trying to get at like a sort of witnessing as experience, but that itself is not really an experience. Because I do think Buber strictly identifies experiencing as solely extracting, solely trying to get at things rather than trying to just be there. Um, so it must be a kind of experience, a kind of non-experience in which you are just being there. But I think even the non-experience is kind of troublesome. I think we would kind of fall into error if we interpret Buber saying, well, there's no experience of this person, and we'd be like, okay, so Buber's talking about this non-experience. I don't think that's actually what he's getting at either. I think it's profoundly more complicated than that, but it seems to me like there's just this dwelling in language rather than being the user of language. Which it would make sense because to be dwelling in language would be which would be the holding to be able to be addressed and addressed back. Okay, so we'll go further on, right? He says, even if the man to whom I say thou is not aware of it in the midst of his experience, yet relation may exist. So you see there, right? The distinction between experience and relation. That you can encounter a thou through another human being, and that human being may not even be aware that they are, in fact, of being a thou, right? They might not even be aware of that coming out. They might not even be cognizant of it. But nonetheless, Buber says you can experience someone, meet a person, and the thou comes out. The relation can exist. He says, for thou is more than it realizes. No deception penetrates here. Here is the cradle of the real life. Okay, so that's kind of the ending on the human being part, but I still feel like there's so much to get at there, and just that last line, for thou is more than it realizes. I think that's actually the key feature of understanding Buber's expression of there's no experience of him. There's a way in which when we experience that we're actually always sort of putting a determination or a fixed point on someone or something. I think now that Buber ends with this thought, we can look at it and be like, oh, what it means to actually not experience someone is to actually understand that there's always more, that there's this constant moreness, that there's this enduring moreness that you can't fixate and you can't pin down. Yeah, so only then we can say thou. Now, I feel like I've spent probably a little bit too long on this, and I want to keep these short. So I guess we'll talk about the realm of spirit, maybe tomorrow, and we can get at something a little bit deeper. But yeah, I want to keep this short. So it seems like we could only address the meeting with human beings as a thou as a thou today. It's maybe tomorrow we'll go into what does it mean to encounter, be addressed by spirit, and so on. Because Buber does say some really interesting things here about that. So, yeah. All right. You guys take care. Bye.